Morning, everyone. As introduced, my name is Master Warrant Officer Alex Arndt. I am a member of the Canadian Armed Forces. I actually work at the Canadian Forces Network Operations Center. And I'm here today to talk to you about the evolution of Canadian Armed Forces cyber operations. Now, some of you may have been here a year ago when I presented on the implications of strong, secure, engaged, and cyber for the Canadian Armed Forces. So this slide deck's going to kind of do a couple of things. One, it's going to kind of leapfrog off of Mr. Boucher's talk about the center and kind of explain where we're going to fit into all of this now that this big pan-government organization exists for IT security. And I'm also going to provide a bit of an update of where we are against strong, secure, engaged in terms of the cyber-related initiatives. So here's my presentation outline today. I'm going to talk about the center. Notice it's in quotes. I'll explain that in a bit. Talk about where we fit in, evolution. I'm going to kind of explain the difference between information technology security and defensive cyber operations. And there's probably some of you sitting here going, there's a difference? I hope to make that clear by the end of my slide deck. So just a quick slide about me. I'm the senior cyber operative in the Canadian Armed Forces. So one of the things Strong, Secure, Engaged did for us was we created a new occupation entirely focused on cyber for the Canadian Armed Forces. I'm the senior operator, even though I've only been a member of this trade for just a little over a year. That's how new we are. I've got quite a bit of cyber experience. That's all I'm really going to talk about on that slide. So the center, or the Canadian Centre for Cybersecurity. So what? Well, we know that it was announced in January of this year, and we know that it's part of the big strategy that was released by the government. And what it does is it brings us a center that's focused on three key areas. And this is just like what Mr. Boucher talked about. Security and resilience, cyber innovation, leadership, and collaboration. The center brings three organizations together to provide this leadership. Now, I found it interesting, Mr. Boucher didn't really touch on this, and there's probably some of you in this room that already know what I'm about to say, but there's three key players that have been brought together to deal with IT security for the government. And that is CSE's IT security branch, Shared Services Canada's Security Operations Center, and Public Safety's Government Cyber Incident Response Center and their Get CyberSafe team. That's quite a bit of capability that's all been put together under one roof and under the leadership of Mr. Boucher as the Director of Operations. And it's got quite a broad area of responsibility. Well, IT security is a broad area of concern, right? There's a lot going on there. If any of you have done anything with the CISP body of knowledge, you know that it's about this wide and about this deep. And in some ways, that's what this organization is trying to deal with. The cool thing is that the information technology security functions are consolidated in one integrated team. And those functions are defense of the Government of Canada's systems, expert advice and guidance. Again, this is a bit of a repeat of what Mr. Boucher said, and trust me, I'm getting on to the better stuff. Threat assessments and reporting, coordinated incident response, and this one's important because, as Mr. Boucher alluded to, they don't want to just deal with government, they want to deal with critical infrastructure protection and helping industry as a whole. And the idea of collective defense that he put forth is a very important one. Secure solutions and services, cybersecurity training and education. Interesting point, public safety is still the organization within the Government of Canada who is responsible for information technology security policy. Something to think about, because policy drives everything. I mean, where I work, well, I'm in the military, so policy is everything for us. If we don't have a regulation or a rule or some kind of an order to tell us what to do, we have no authorities to do anything. And by extension, policy of this nature is required to to guide the government and to guide all the folks involved in this effort on what they can and cannot do, those red lines that Mr. Boucher talked about. But public safety remains solely responsible for policy. Now, that's not meant as a commentary or some kind of a judgment on that. It's a key highlight. So, Canadian Armed Forces integration into the center. And I'm using the center because it's a lot easier to say than the mouthful of Canadian Center for Cybersecurity. We have one defensive cyber unit in the Canadian Armed Forces right now. That is the unit I'm a member of, the Canadian Forces Network Operations Center, or CIFNOC. Historically, CIFNOC has performed IT security functions for the Department of National Defense and the Canadian Armed Forces. From our inception in 2003 until now-ish, because we're in a transition period, we were delivering the IT security program in partnership with some other folks for the department and the armed forces. We had partners to do this. Some of you in this room may even work for some of these folks. And this year I have less familiar faces than I had last year, but that's okay. You've got Defense Information Management, Engineering and Integration. You've got Director of Information Management Security, and then you've got our Information Systems Security Officers. They're the main partners in what we do. So ISSOs, I think that's somewhat self-evident, somewhat self-explanatory. This is the person in an organization who is the pointy end of the stick when something happens that people are supposed to tell. I got a weird email today. It might be a phishing attack. What do I do? And hopefully the ISSO is well-versed and sorts it out, and most of them are, especially in our department. And then they get a hold of us after telling the user to just delete it. And they let us know what's going on. If it's something more serious, like a breach, whatever, again, ISSOs are kind of that frontline worker in what we try to do. DRIAM Secure, their responsibility is that certification accreditation process, or what we're now calling SANA, making sure that audits and people are compliant with direction and best practices. And then DIME, they're the folks engineering all the solutions that help make things happen. So whether that's firewalls or host-based protective measures like EDR, they're the folks that are doing all that research and development and deployment. So, CIFNOC's obviously still got a role to play in IT security, even though I'm here to talk about its evolution. We're going to make sure that we work with the center. We have a person who's integrated in the center. Actually, it's part of what came with the center or became part of the center. That person that we have is still integrated there and is still part of the reporting lines. Helps us keep our finger on the pulse of the big hand, small map information technology security concerns. We're all aware of the trends right now. I mean, again, I'm going to sound almost like I'm repeating Mr. Boucher, but it bears repeating. Ransomware, organized crime, malware, all these things that are whacking our networks on a day-to-day basis, mostly unsuccessfully, thank goodness, but they're out there and they're a threat. And even something as simple as a phishing email, if it bears the right thing, and it can be an absolute bad day at the office, we all know this. These are things we need to know what's going on so that we can make sure we're looking for the right things at the right time. And it's all about efficiencies and responsiveness. But the center is going to be the main organization responsible for this stuff across the government. And that will include D&D, because Shared Services Canada, as part of their SOC, is responsible for IT security on D&D networks below the classified level. So our internet connected and intranet, or DWAN as some of you may know it, that stuff's all Shared Services Canada's responsibility, not ours. We don't manage it. We don't even have admin credentials on it anymore. So it's really important to understand that there's a responsibility that now lies with somebody else. So some of you might be going, well, wait a minute, aren't you giving up your ground? Are you not giving up your, and last year I used this term and I'm going to use it again, key cyber terrain? Yes and no. And this is where the evolution starts to get talked about. We get to evolve towards defensive cyber operations instead of IT security. And Again, it's, well, don't you use the same things? You've got the firewalls and the IDSs and the EDR and all these countermeasures and monitoring tools and best practices. Yes, but the fundamental difference is the focus. So the mission of the Canadian Forces Network Operations Center is to gain and maintain cyber superiority to allow supported commanders freedom of movement in our cyber environment. That is our raison d'etre. That is what we do. It sounds very far-reaching, but as I explain this evolution, it makes a lot more sense now than it ever did, even though we've been using this since we stood up. We conduct defensive cyber operations on behalf of the Canadian Army, the Royal Canadian Navy, the Royal Canadian Air Force, and anybody else who's using D&D and CAF networks. Where we are transitioning, where this focus shift is occurring, is that instead of us trying to do it all, from Halifax to Esquimalt and Alert to Toronto, we are now focusing on those operations and those networks that support those operations that are critical to commanders deployed and conducting operations either domestically or internationally. So instead of trying to secure it all, we're securing those key pieces of the network or that key cyber terrain to ensure those commanders can conduct their missions and have their means. So this is not unlike if it was a radio net. We're making sure that they're doing what they need to do and that they have the awareness and the information they need, including intelligence, to use their radio nets to best effect without being denied those nets. So any of you with any familiarity in electronic warfare know that there's things like jamming and other attacks, and there's spoofing. All the same concepts that occur in electronic warfare, very applicable to defensive cyber operations in a kind of a high-level concept. So, last year when I briefed defensive cyber operations, there were two definitions that were given, and I'm going to repeat one of them because it is the one that matters for what we do today. There was defensive cyber operations, internal defensive measures, and then there was defensive cyber operations, reactive actions. We do not do RA. DCO RA is something that happens on a piece of cyber terrain, or in other words, a network, that you don't own. That's bordering on offensive actions. That's that active piece that's been talked about and shared in Strong, Secure, Engaged. And the policy space has not evolved yet. Last year I talked about how there's key legislation that's currently in consideration but has not gone through that would enable things. It enables our partners like CSE to do some stuff. We don't yet have that green light. So active remains an aspiration as opposed to an ability right now. So IDM is what we do, and that internal defensive work, internal defensive measures. So that sounds an awful lot like IT security. Again, the big difference between an IT security program and DCO IDM is that we are doing it specifically in support of given things, and I'll give an example. So, as many of you know, Canada has committed to supporting the United Nations through op presence in Mali. Hypothetically, and it is entirely hypothetically, if there was a network deployed in support of that operation that there was a threat against, it would be our job to identify what those threats might be, identify the possible countermeasures that should be deployed to protect it, and then provide all that monitoring and reaction and response to things that occur on that network. So that becomes a piece of key cyber terrain that we're responsible for securing. We perform some work on it, and we keep the commander informed of what this piece of cyber ground is like on any given day. So just like what we call maneuver warfare is supported through intelligence and various enablers like engineers and electronic warfare and stuff to make sure that the piece of ground the commander is responsible for is secure, it's surveyed, it is managed. Same thing, only now it's cyber terrain or a network. So there's the definition of defensive cyber operations. I am not going to flog this horse. You can read it for yourself, but as you can see, it has an IT security flavor. And this is kind of motherhood apple pie for us, but the important thing is that it is not an enterprise-wide effort. It is focused. It is deliberate. In fact, the big phrase we're using these days is deliberately planned. And that's because while you deliberately plan an IT security program between procurement and deployment and just all the people, all the stakeholders involved, that kind of a program will take months, if not years, to implement. I mean, we've been doing IT security in some sense in the department for more than 20 years, and there's still lots of room for improvement like there is in any organization, because this battle space, as we refer to it in the military context, is ever evolving. The threat is always changing, and it's like the most complicated game of cat and mouse, right? If you think that I've done this, and this, and my certification and accreditation's been signed off, so I'm good to go, I'm done, you're not doing yourself any justice or your shareholders any justice from an IT security perspective. Likewise for us from a supported commander perspective, if we just put some things out, hit the tick boxes and go, yep, checklist complete, we're not doing defensive cyber ops. And there's the textbook definition for IDM. And of course, I will be open for some questions at the end if anybody has any. So, quote from the commander of CFIOG, or the Canadian Forces Information Operations Group, my boss's boss, if you will, or I guess my boss's boss's boss, but whatever. Canadian Forces Network Operations Center's role is not to be another layer in the IT security. It is to defend and defeat our adversaries in this battle space being cyber. So even the commander, the person who tells us what we're supposed to do, has made it very clear that we're not here to do IT security for the department. We are here to do defensive cyber operations. And it's this directive, this direction, that has started the evolution that we are currently embarked upon. So, now the so what of my presentation. He keeps talking about IT security, keeps talking about DCO. What's the difference? This is IT security. Really high level, quick and dirty, a few key points, right? It's information assurance, threat agnostic, vulnerability focused. It's all about compliance and best practices, and it's industry standards. So it's the stuff that makes most of us have work on any given day. Here's the difference. It's all about mission assurance for us, and I'm going to segue off into mission assurance in a sec because there's kind of two flavors of that. Adversary focus. So again, it is not about your terrain and what its risks are in terms of the, say for example, the top 10. That's not what this is about. It's about, is somebody actively targeting? Is somebody actively conducting offensive cyber operations against a piece of key cyber terrain? It's command and control. These nets, just like radios, are part of the command and control infrastructure for a commander. This is how they make decisions because they get information from it, and then how they give orders by sending that information across it. It's also how intelligence is shared. And it's all about movement and maneuver. Even our ground forces in combat vehicles have digital connectivity and comms, non-voice, in their equipment right now. So if they can't trust that network and the information that's on it, we have a mission problem. So the key focus here is making sure that the mission is supported, the mission is secure, and that they can trust that network in support of that given mission. So that's a much smaller piece of the overall infrastructure, or the overall enterprise that we have to worry about. Of course, we're doing it for a bunch of operations, so there's some concurrence, but it's better than doing the whole thing. If I just accidentally laze somebody, I apologize. I hit the wrong button. So how has CIFNOC changed? So CIFNOC is organized on some lines of effort, and much of what you see on this slide right now is a direct result of what happened when CIFNOC was built in 2003. It was very much an IT security focused organization. Following the very trends at the time, it had both network service delivery and network security integrated into one team. And you had your network operations, the central attendance service. That's, believe it or not, that was our phone operator. So that's, to connect your call, please provide a local, that kind of thing. integral IT support, that's Charlie Squadron for the folks in the room that are from CIFNOC. Hi, Mike. And then our technical site inspection folks, and our defensive cyber operations and incident handling teams. And in case of DCO, that's all the functions you would expect. That's what we call surveillance, what you would call your IDS team perhaps, or the folks that are looking at your logs and doing all your event correlation using the SIEM to get the job done. That includes the reconnaissance team, or network vulnerability analysis folks, and it even involves our red team or the threat emulation folks. I think that's again fairly self-explanatory. Well, decision was made in order to enable this evolvement of things and to help focus CIFNOC more. We're splitting off all that service delivery stuff. No more about their blinking lights. It's not what we're here for. The network links is somebody else's problem now, and in this case it's 7 Communications Group. And away they go. So now those organizations, those pieces of the organization have been given to somebody else. Now network service delivery and network availability is a different organization. Still a partner, but not our circus, not our monkeys, if you will. So, CIFNOC evolution, we've talked about it. Venn diagram, very helpful, right? How much of these circles overlapped? I would argue that from 2003 until 2017, those circles were pretty much one on top of another, very close to it. As we move towards DCO IDM and deliberately planned defensive cyber operations in support of deployed and domestic operations in Canada and abroad, it's very much more towards the right. The circles are separating. So I'll back up, because I said I was going to talk about mission assurance. So, mission assurance. Some of you in this room are going, mission assurance, doesn't that mean something else? For those of you that paid attention to Strong, Secure, Engaged, and one of the initiatives that I'm not discussing today, but I did discuss last year, it talked about a mission assurance program. So, assuring the mission from a defensive cyber operations standpoint is those deliberate actions, that DCO IDM stuff. Mission assurance is more platform centric. So when I say platform, I don't mean the thing I'm standing on, obviously, and I'm sorry if I'm being pedantic, but platforms in our case is things like aircraft and ships and armored fighting vehicles. The digital infrastructures in each one of those pieces of equipment represent an attack surface. And in an extreme scenario, if that attack surface results in the vehicle being somehow compromised, and even worse, if a weapon system can be exploited remotely by a non-friendly actor, we're having a bad day. Now, I'm not saying any of those things exist, but this is what mission assurance is about. Mission assurance is an engineering activity that takes place during procurement and development that ensures that the risks are minimized and any residual risk is mitigated. So this is more of a Assistant Deputy Minister material function in collaboration with the Army, the Navy, and the Air Force, as opposed to a CIFNOC function. Now, the interesting thing is that DCO operations, sorry, that's redundant, DCO is kind of support of this. Once the MA has been done and the system is deployed, or the platform, you still need to protect it as it's part of a bigger network, as part of a bigger operation. So you still have to help make sure that the things that residual risk is managed, but we're not there at the beginning to make sure it's done. That's not CIFNOC's role, and that's not a DCO function. So hopefully that clarifies. So now I'm gonna move off and kind of talk a little bit more about evolution in the big hand, small map sense, because Strong, Secure, Engaged laid out 7 initiatives last year when it was released in June, and I briefed them all on what the implications were for the department, or for the Canadian Armed Forces from a cyber perspective. Today I'm going to talk about 4 of them, because we've made quite a bit of progress on 2, and there's 2 that we're still working on. And before anybody goes, I don't know what these initiative numbers are, don't worry, I've got a slide. So the whole point of all this is as we evolve, we're not going to be duplicating the center's functions. The center will be responsible for the enterprise-wide IT security, and while we will use similar techniques and similar technologies, when we do DCO, it's in deliberate support of an operation. Yes, I'm a broken record, I know. But it is a different thing, right? It's just like a particular line of business might have special needs in terms of their IT security program and making sure that, you know, the web servers and their security might be a very different focus and effort than the email infrastructure, for example. Think of it in that sense. But at this point, and again, I'm going to flash them up, Initiatives 65 and 89 are being met. Now 89, that's the one that's near and dear to my heart because that's the one that established the occupation I'm now the senior member of, so it's kind of cool that we're making some progress. And 75 and 88 continue to be worked on. So just as a reminder, and sorry if it's a bit of an eye chart, 65 was talking about cryptographic capabilities, information operations capabilities, cyber capabilities, including offensive. 75 was talking about the reserve force, and last year when I briefed, a lot of the questions I got at the end of my briefing were related to, okay, I'm an IT security professional working here in Ottawa and I'd really like to contribute. How do I join the reserves? I'd love to tell you that I'm going to be able to stand here today and give you the answer to that question because I couldn't last year. And while I can provide an update, there's still really no answer yet. And I'll get into that if time permits. 88 is the cyber capabilities, that offensive piece. And 89, of course, is the cyber force, growing the cyber force, including the cyber operator occupation. So we've made some progress. I've already talked about why the offensive piece hasn't gone very far yet. It's a legislative problem. It's a legal issue. It's the answer to the question, so what constitutes an act of war in cyber is still being worked on. Just to nip any questions in that area in the bud right off the bat. And of course the reserve piece is still being worked on because it ends up employing reservists is hard. We don't have one reserve employment structure, we actually have three because the Air Force, the Navy, and the Army all employ their reservists differently, but cyber is a what we call a purple problem, or it touches all of them, and we don't have an employment structure that lets us employ people across all three environments. So it's part of the HR challenge we're dealing with.